Hello and welcome to the Republic of Ezo. I am your host, Zach Yost. Today I am so excited to bring to you all an interview I did with a very special guest, Jeff Deist, the current president of the Mises Institute and formerly Ron Paul's chief of staff back when he was in Congress. And today we have a quite interesting discussion about the nature of contemporary libertarianism and liberalism, some of Jeff's thoughts on grad school, and also some of his literature recommendations. So check it out. So welcome to the podcast, Jeff. Thanks so much for coming on. How are you today?
I'm fantastic, Zachary. How are you?
I'm doing great, though I can't wait for warmer weather to come.
Well, I hope the background's all right. I decided to do this in my office today, so it's a little dark in here, but I'm very comfortable around all my books.
Yes, that's perfect. As I've got all my books as well.
Yeah.
So I wanted to start off our discussion today talking about the current state of liberalism/libertarianism. Because that was kind of a major impetus for me starting this podcast, is kind of to look around. If we look around today, it doesn't look like things are going exactly well, especially with COVID and everything. Not a very good time for liberalism. And personally, I've been exploring what Richard Wagner calls muscular liberalism, which is, more interested. It recognizes that power exists in society, and that if we just ignore that, things aren't going to go well. It is the short version. So what are your thoughts on how things are going in the state of libertarianism/liberalism as a philosophical kind of political movement?
Well, it's obviously a very difficult time. Not just an illiberal time, but I think also in many ways a profoundly anti-intellectual time. And part of me appreciates that, because part of me is certainly a populist. I think populism is not an ideology per se. Mm-hmm. Populism is simply anti-elitism. And if we look at the current crop of elites across the West, I think antipathy for them is entirely justified. I think they screwed everything up.
Yeah. They
made a mess of things, and they deserve to be knocked off their pedestal and replaced. So I'm pro-populist in that sense. I think Rothbard had a real pugnacious populist streak to him.
Yeah.
Obviously, Pat Buchanan did. Donald Trump did. I mean, Ron Paul doesn't personally have a populist streak, but I think some of his fans have a populist streak to them.
For sure.
And again, when the National Reviews of the world or the Cato's or the Reasons of the world sort of dismiss this populism as inherently bad, inherently illiberal, I'm not so convinced. But I do think a healthy society needs intellectuals. And despite all the problems we have with academia and with PhDs and, all the talk of useless college degrees and this and that, I do think we need a cohort of educated intellectuals to make for a good society. I would just argue we've got the wrong ones, and we have too many. Mm-hmm. Probably, I agree with Charles Murray that probably only a fraction of people should even go to undergraduate, much less graduate school. So, that's a problem in society, and that's a lot of this uneasiness we're all feeling, I think, has manifested in populism. And so instead of attacking that or dismissing it, liberals ought to be asking why. And they don't want to do that. They want to do everything but that. They want to demonize and look down on especially working class whites. Those are the truly hated people in society today. And people are very open about this. You know, it's an unfortunate time. And so that's the deplorables and the Trumpers. And if you look at things like the so-called January 6th riot or insurrection or whatever, if you look at the Canadian trucker convoy, and you look at the criticism and the narratives surrounding those events, what you'll find is that basically amongst liberal elites, and so we're using that term broadly in today's parlance, that would include like Hillary Clinton, for instance.
Yeah.
You know, they basically posit that, you know, white working class people, especially men, by definition, as oppressors, cannot have a legitimate political grievance. Right? Almost by definition, you cannot have a legitimate political grievance, whether that's vaccines or mandates or gas prices or woke LGBT education at your kid's school, whatever it might be. I mean, you literally need to sort of sit down and shut up because of your identity. And so I don't think that's very healthy.
And
so when we talk about liberalism, you know, what's the state of liberalism today? I think first and foremost, we have to define it. And I would very much define that term. I don't really care for the term libertarianism much anymore, especially as a noun. Yes. I think libertarian ought to be an adjective, like there's a libertarian policy on X. So let's just stick with liberalism and go from there. I view that term as having a distinctly 19th century definition and connotation rather than a 20th century. And this is probably the single biggest distinction between what I would consider, in my opinion, good and bad liberals. A good liberal is a Misesian 19th century liberal. A bad liberal is a 20th century Hillary Clinton liberal. In other words, this is a real split. This is a real source of animosity and confusion and dissent between even amongst free market circles. In other words, was the 20th century, with all of its difficulties, more or less a liberal triumph in the West? A lot of people would say yes. Or was it an illiberal disaster in terms of central banking, income taxes, too horrific, European wars, police actions and interventionist foreign policies, huge Great Society and New Deal entitlement programs, unbelievable diminutions of property rights. Mm-hmm. You know, from a kind of a harder Rothbardian perspective, that's all illiberal. Okay, so first, you know, how do we even look at the 20th century? So if we go back to Mises, born in the 1880s, but very much culturally a man of old Europe, pre-World War I Europe. And from his perspective, I mean, coming from a small town in Galicia, which is now Ukraine, was Poland, coming to Vienna must have been like, a kid from small town Alabama going to New York City or going to Paris, right? Mm-hmm. So it must have just been, and as we know, the cultural, the musical, the intellectual output of pre-war Vienna is almost unparalleled. So he goes there and he's steeped in that milieu, this unbelievable intellectual milieu. And so after World War I, in the interwar years, he writes two books, which I think are underappreciated in terms of his oeuvre, namely Nation, State, and Economy, and then Liberalism.
Yep.
I guess 1919 and 1927, if I'm correct. So these books give us an absolute blueprint. They're both short. You can read them pretty quickly. They're not like Human Action or something. Yeah. And you could give those to any politician on earth today, from the Far East to Brussels to DC, and say, just read this. That's all you need. This is literally a roadmap for how to organize your society. And so Misesian liberalism, I think we can break it down and basically say it's got sort of three components. The first component is that a liberal society is laissez-faire at home, economically. Okay, that's absolutely first and foremost, which includes property rights, which includes a healthy degree of economic freedom. Less any taxes or regulations that a small d Democrat like Mises would view as necessary for order, for police, for national defense, for basic tribunals. Not an anarchist. Okay, so if we have laissez-faire at home. And number two, the second required element is that there needs to be trade abroad. Because he saw even before World War II, even before the 30s, even before Hitler's expansionist goals, that if you didn't have trade with other nations, that would tend to cause nations, individual nations, to become autarkic, and they would seek to have all industry, and all material goods produced and services produced at home. And so, since that's pretty difficult for a lot of especially smaller countries, and he was coming out of the patchwork of old Europe, the principalities, the dukedoms, the territories, most of them individually would not have all the raw materials and all the manpower and all the things. Yeah. So as a result of that, if they didn't have trade with other areas abroad, then they'd start to become warlike and expansionist because they'd want to go out and get more stuff and more territory. So no. If nations were going to have laissez-faire at home as part of their liberal program, they also needed trade abroad to keep them liberal, right, as opposed to expansionist. But number three, and this is where I think a lot of people miss the ball on Mises' liberalism, is they needed to have a sense of very definite self-determination. This is a term that Mises uses over and over and over again. And what did he mean by that? Well, he meant the ability for people to govern themselves as they see fit based on their own, particularized or localized interests. And what he comes back to time and time again, this is from his experience coming out of old polyglot Europe, is that he worries, he frets about linguistic minorities. To him, there's almost nothing worse than to be contained within a political unit, and let's call it a country or a nation, but to be a linguistic minority, whether that was, you can imagine what Germany used to be, all the regions in Germany, now in one huge sort of super state. Germany must have, seemed huge relative to its 1800s past. So yeah. He said, if you're a linguistic minority, then you're going to be sort of politically and otherwise disadvantaged. And so to him, language was a linchpin for culture and all kinds of things, So these linguistic groups, if they were all housed, if multiple linguistic groups were housed under one political entity, that to him was a recipe for disaster and trouble and dissent. So he said, well, we need to allow for radical self-determination up to and including, he even talks about if there was some way to, really have these super small administrative units, we'd even have to allow that. So a lot of fans of Mises who consider themselves cosmopolitan, open borders, etc., they go back to his concepts in liberalism, and I think they misstate them a bit, because Mises' entire liberal program starts, he even says it could be condensed down to a single word: property. Okay, that's not what most libertarians want to say. Right? They want to talk about self-actualization and freedom and be who you are and these kind of almost social concepts. But for Mises, it comes down to property first and foremost. And from property flows all kinds of things. But if you don't have property rights, you really have nothing. And so you have property, you have trade, and you have self-determination. And self-determination is the rub, because that means letting some people go. And that means that liberalism, in my opinion, what Mises was saying in part, was that liberalism requires you to not have a universalist set of governance or policy prescriptions. That means you have to let some other people, especially people who speak a different language or have a different culture, have their own political arrangement. And that may not be to your satisfaction or liking, especially when it comes to ceding territory or ceding GDP or anything like that. I mean, most governments want to increase and expand their power and lord over more people, not fewer. But nonetheless, when we're talking about definitions, that's where Mises was. So in Nation, State, and Economy in particular, I mean, he has entire chapters, sections called a liberal nationalism. And today, I think we've been conditioned to think that that's an oxymoron. In other words, nationalism is this nasty, outward, expansionist, xenophobic, jingoistic thing. It's sort of this, our way is best and we want to impose it on everyone. And so Orwell said something along the lines of patriotism is loving your country, nationalism is wanting to impose your country on others. So I think Mises understood this, and he at least in the theoretical realm said you have to allow for non-universalist political prescriptions. And he has a lot of passages, even in Human Action, which he's writing much later in life, against universalism. And what he's saying, by what measure do we determine the true God, the true policy, the true benefit? It's not so easy. And if we look at the world today, I'm not so sure that a Confucian Chinese person or a Buddhist monk or the Dalai Lama, I'm not sure that they would all share our conception of property rights. What's this strong delineation between my stuff and other people's stuff? That's kind of a Western thing. And so I think a lot of Mises's fans take his liberalism to mean cosmopolitanism, which is a term he actually uses fewer times than most people imagine. But nonetheless, cosmopolitan in the Misesian sense of the word or usage, in my opinion, simply means not provincial. It means interested in ideas and things and places beyond your own, hometown or your own life and family or your own work. It means having broader interests in the world. It does not mean necessarily accepting a whole host of what we might call left cultural precepts. And I think that's the way that people today in libertarian circles use the term cosmopolitan, including open borders. It means accepting this whole sort of host of what we would consider left culture. And I don't think he meant it that way. I think he meant not provincial. And so to me, the provincialism we see today, I mean, what's provincial? To me, provincial means unable to imagine a life or a worldview much unlike one's own. And to me, like globalists, left globalists today are the most provincial people on earth. Manhattanites are the most provincial people on earth. My God. I mean, people in Brussels are incredibly provincial. They cannot imagine that anyone could disagree with their prescription, which is basically social democracy. I mean, the idea to them that anyone could not see the self-evident superiority of global social democracy, just renders that person a fool or a redneck or a deplorable or something. I mean, to me, when you can't understand how other people could not see the world the same way as you, that's provincial. That's provincial. So I'm for a liberalism that allows for all kinds of things in terms of political self-determination that I might not personally like. You know, a lot of people look at your hometown of Pittsburgh. A lot of people would say, hey, you know, back when we had steel tariffs, you know, that made Japanese steel a lot more expensive, and we had good paying union jobs in our steel mills. And as a result of those good paying jobs, we had, you know, our churches were more full, our little leagues were more full, the restaurants around the steel mills were doing well, you know, so protectionism works, right? There's a lot of people in Pittsburgh who certainly thought that.
For sure, lots of people think that still today.
Right? So, so I disagree. I think that when you look at the broader economy as a whole, I think that those tariffs benefit one group of people in the domestic steel industry at the expense of all Americans who might need to buy steel when next time they bought an automobile. Steel would be contained in that. Maybe that car is $10 more than it otherwise would be. Who knows? But nonetheless, you know, is it my job to simply make sure that Pittsburghers and free traders are all housed under one government, and that government is laissez-faire and doesn't allow protectionist tariffs? Or is it my job to sort of want to decentralize and decouple the governance of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania from the governance of Auburn, Alabama, the college town where I happen to live? You know, those are interesting questions, but I think one of the big pushbacks to globalism and the source of a lot of left-wing angst over what they see as illiberal populism is because they insisted on this universal prescription, and that it was progressive, it was deterministic, it was inevitable, there was an arc to history. Hillary Clinton's the next president, right? Hillary Clinton's the first female president of the United States. I mean, these things were just sort of, you know, inevitable. And so when their sense of liberalism got shaken up by things like Brexit, by things like Donald Trump winning, I think psychologically they responded very badly to that. And it made them double down and say, oh, no, there's no way that these retrograde racist deplorables are onto anything. It's just they're bad and they need to be punished and they need to be vanquished politically. And how do we do that? We do that with a universalist conception of governance. And we beat everybody over the head and shoulders with it until we get it across the West. You know, the EU is an example of that. The Brussels overlay, sort of a superstate in Europe. You know, the tremendous power of DC in the 20th century, centralizing everything. So we have a superstate in DC. You know, we think of the U.S. government as bossing around the rest of the world with its interventionism, its nation building, making the world safe for democracy. But we forget that it's equally interventionist and a bully with respect to the 50 states, which are supposed to have a much healthier degree of autonomy. So when we accept this universalist idea of liberalism versus what I would consider the radically decentralist Misesian version of liberalism, what you get is this idea that, you know, the political stakes are so high, everything is winner take all. Everything has to be decided by a few thousand people in DC, or maybe even just a majority of 5 judges in robes have to decide abortion policy for the whole country. Well, that doesn't sound very, very wise. That sounds like the opposite of social cohesion. That sounds like a terrible idea.
Yeah, the federal government becomes, in effect, the nuclear weapon, and it creates a security dilemma, basically. Even if whatever group you're part of doesn't necessarily at the beginning want power, they just want to be left alone. The incentive is, if we don't seize power, well, the other, we don't know what they'll do, but they're probably bad. They'll use it against us. So I think that contributes a lot to just the terrible state of relations between people with different views. And on the universalism, I think you hit it right on the head when you said that it in its own way it's so provincial. The whole world has to be America, in effect. Whereas the whole world's a very diverse place. People live in lots of different ways, and I think that's awesome and good, and that understanding your own, that if you understand your own way of life, your own culture, your own nation, that allows you in turn to have solid footing to then go and appreciate other cultures, other ways that they do things. And I think that a liberalism in China would look very different from an American or a British or European form of liberalism. And the same thing for Russia and India.
Mm-hmm.
And if you insist everyone has to live like you, yeah, I don't think that's cosmopolitan. That's kind of a crushing conformity on a global scale. And it leads to it leads to global crusading too. I mean, we can see that back. I mean, I was in elementary school, but the Iraq War, there were libertarians who favored that because, oh, we're going to bring liberalism to Iraq. And it's a terrible disaster. And I also wanted to touch on what you said about kind of the difference between the Misesian conception of liberalism and this more progressive liberalism. As you said, Mises says that property is the core of liberalism, upholding the social order, really. That when I consider myself a liberal, I think our job is to uphold the social order so that the division of labor can continue. And I think that's an area where our form of liberalism has a lot of overlap with conservatives who hate libertarianism or liberalism because they think of this progressive conception of it. Going all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, they both said the division of labor is the beginning of society. And as Mises pointed out, this is not some natural society itself is not some as natural as, you know, the earth. It's something that's been created over generations and generations. And I want to read a quote to you that I think really captures this core divide between Misesian liberals who believe, you know, upholding the social order, promoting intersocial and external peace is kind of our core job, to what some other libertarians think. So this is from 2008, and you can probably guess who said this. We are in fact living at the cusp of what should be called the libertarian moment, the dawning not of some fabled, cliched, and loosey-goosey age of Aquarius, but a time of increasingly hyper-individualized, hyper-expanded choice over every aspect of our lives, from 401ks to hot and cold running coffee drinks, from life-saving pharmaceuticals to online dating services. So this, of course, was from at the time was a very popular essay, The Libertarian Moment by Nick Gillespie and Matt Welsh, who I like, but I think that's worlds away from a Misesian conception of liberalism. I think it leads to atomization of that conception, which itself undermines the social order, I would say.
Well, I think most people today would say that liberalism requires self-actualization, or it implies it, maybe is a better term. And so self-actualization requires the conditions for self-actualization, which means essentially a positive rights worldview. Mm-hmm. No one is truly free to be who they are, live as they wish, be fully themselves, to use the dreadful, awful, horrible parlance of our times. No one's truly free, and no society is truly liberal until these pesky things like rent and food and healthcare and free college have all been taken care of. if you have to strive all day in some crappy workaday job to get those things, even a bare modicum of those things, then you're not really free, because you can't go, be self-actualized under those conditions. And so it's a pretty small leap from the passage you just read to that sort of positive rights worldview. I mean, the idea that, well, somehow, society needs to provide me with the environment where I can do all these things. And part of that environment is just this incredible internet where one click away, I can go look at my, my particular fetish or something. And so, I mean, that's fine. Nobody should be banning that. But I mean, laying around and smoking pot all day is fine. It doesn't hurt anyone else, but you can't build a culture or society around everybody sitting around smoking pot all day. I mean, that's the thing. So it strikes me that we need more internal governance if we're going to have less external governance. And I don't know how you do that with this animosity towards the intermediary institutions in society, whatever those might be, not just the individual atomized, because then you really are sort of playing into the right-wing parody of a hyper individualized hellscape.
Yeah, exactly. And I think some libertarians go astray, even ones who aren't super obsessed with self-actualization or anything like that, is a kind of tunnel vision focus on the state alone. The state is no doubt terrible and responsible for many of our ills, but it's not the be-all end-all of society. There are, as you mentioned, these mediating institutions that make up our existence itself. Being in your family, your church, your local groups and clubs and things like that. They're an essential part of human existence. And furthermore, they are themselves sources of power. And as you once mentioned, I believe at the talk at Mises U, atomized individuals, the state loves those because they're completely vulnerable to its machinations, whereas these intermediary groups, they themselves have power. And if you think, oh, the family's oppressive and has to go, well, then all you've done is taken one pole of power that balanced against the state and given its power to the state itself. So I think it'd be good if libertarians brushed up more on classic mid-century sociology of people like Robert Nisbet and people like that. Frank Tannenbaum has a really excellent essay called The Balance of Power in Society that just lays out this kind of framework that there's only so much power in society, and when a function is taken from one entity and absorbed by the state, well, that entity loses existential purpose and it loses power, and the state gains more power. So I wish more libertarians explored and cared about that stuff rather than just super focused on the state, because the state, while it's the problem, the solution lies beyond just politics itself in the electoral sense.
Well, I'm not sure there's much left of those institutions. I mean, we have the state. We have, after COVID especially, we have big corporations.
Yeah.
Which are increasingly entangled. And then we have academia. But I'm not sure there's much else left. So I'm not sure how we go back. I mean, I don't think you go backwards ever. I think you go forwards. But if you look at secularization in the United States, libertarians hate religion. But if you look at secularization in the United States, it is radically accelerating. Number of people who respond as having particular faith, and especially more importantly than that, who respond as attending services on any regular basis, is plummeting. That's just the reality. We can't, that's just a demographic truth, a reality. So secularism is very, very strongly correlated across geography with lower rates of childbirth. Those two things are, very, very strongly correlated across the West. So as societies become more secular, as they become more wealthy or ostensibly wealthy, childbirth usually plummets. So those are very difficult things to change or reverse if you care to, because they ought not to be political matters. They've been politicized, but I'm not sure a political ideology is muscular enough, in your phrase, to correct that. I mean, I think there's a lot to it. How do you get especially younger people invested in the future? Well, part of that is economics and money, right? I mean, and part of it, I think, is more social or spiritual or even religious, but it's not something that you can fix, I think, with public policy per se.
Oh, for sure. Yes. I don't think that I'm very much against the Orban style family subsidy and all that. I didn't want to imply I think we should be doing this really policy wise, although I'm sure there are policies and regulations that are interfering. But I think for me, I have a very broad conception of politics, I suppose, as I use the term. So I would consider things like decisions like having children and things like that to be on some level to be political, but not in the sense of the state. Because in my conception, politics is much more beyond the state. It's religious institutions and the family, et cetera, et cetera. And I think I completely agree. We can't go back. I know Rothbard said, I believe it was him, we have to repeal the 20th century. I just like that phrase. You can't repeal what's already happened. We have to move forward. But I think in terms of the solution, it kind of goes back to what you said, internal regulation, that rather than obsessively arguing on Twitter that gets nowhere, people should maybe look more into, what's happening with their own life. Are you contributing to society in a productive manner? Are you, marriage rates among my generation are abysmal. I mean, I'm not married either, but if I think about it a lot, and I think, what's my life going to look like in another 30 or 40 years if I'm not married? And I am worried about what society will look like when we have such a inverted pyramid of older people in need of care.
Right.
The state's inevitably going to step in. I mean, I would not be shocked if there's the expropriation of retirement accounts and things like that, because there'll be so few. I mean, people think Social Security is bad now. What's it going to be when we look more like Japan with so few workers and things like that? So that's what I was getting at. And I just I completely agree with the internal regulation component being important. And I'm curious for your thoughts on libertarianism as a ideology. Because and what I mean by that is kind of a totalizing I mean it in the negative sense, in like a Vogelinian or Kirk sense of this kind of blinders that people put on, that they see the entire world through that lens. One thing I dislike is when people tend to view like the non-aggression principle as the be-all end-all of ethics and of socially acceptable behavior and things like that. I think that sometimes it can be stunting to people's development. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on people moving beyond kind of how people can advance, how they can continue to intellectually enrich themselves for being a cosmopolitan in the Misesian sense, liberal.
Well, I mean, libertarian is really a legal theory about when force ought to be permissible in society, but and as such, it's a political theory considering the state. But when you say totalizing, I mean, if someone calls your wife a whore, you ought to punch them in the face, right? I mean, and so is that violate some aggression principle? Maybe. I mean, who cares? Who cares? Totalizing. I would like to think that a libertarian adjective, political view, is not ideological. To me, it's the absence of ideology. It's what happens when you just leave people alone. Mm-hmm. Well, they create capital and accumulate capital and invest capital and trade with one another in a win-win perspective. That was Menger's whole point about value. It's not equal value for value. It's the perception on both sides that you're better off with that pair of shoes than the $50 you spent on them. And likewise for the shoemaker. So I think liberty is just what happens in the absence of the state. And so I'd like to think of it as non-ideological, but clearly our detractors would say, no, this is rabidly ideological. You have this crazy view of a stateless or near stateless world, which is at odds with human history, which is at odds with a lot of human philosophy and experience. And so, you guys are crazy ideologues to even suggest this. Mm-hmm. I mean, we all get that criticism. We all understand that. I mean, you can see sort of from a normie perspective, the basic logic behind that, right?
Yeah.
Well, what happens when there's Putin, Mr. Libertarian, right? A fair question. Mm-hmm. A fair question. Where are the stateless international mechanisms which have developed? For example, the entire code of maritime law. Imagine back in the seafaring days of the Dutch and the Spanish. Imagine a code of maritime law, which everyone had to deal with pirates. People had to deal with contracts unfulfilled, shipments which didn't make it to where they said they were going to make it. I mean, this evolved in a very natural common law manner into what we now think of as maritime law. And yes, some of that has been codified by states legislatively in the meantime, but nonetheless, we'd like to think that something like that could have evolved to deal with a Putin and a Ukraine. But it's very difficult now with all the decades and centuries of statism to go back and peel back the onion, right? So Mises would say regarding Ukraine, look, there clearly is such a thing as a Ukrainian versus a Russian. And first and foremost, the number one hallmark of that distinction would be a separate language, which the Ukrainians have. So that's clear. The Ukrainians have a Misesian, or ought to have a Misesian right of self-determination. Now, Putin has violated that by invading them, but maybe the greater violation was decades ago when the former Soviet Union was sending ethnic Russians into other territories in a very kind of nasty, almost eugenic way of, going in there and breeding and adding Russians to the population. Not very pleasant thing to contemplate. But nonetheless, that happened. So even today, within a lot of the former Soviet satellites, there are people who are more favorable towards Russia because they have an ethnic, they feel an ethnic attachment to that. So, that's the rub here. And would Westerners in their, non-common law dispute resolution mechanisms, the International Criminal Court, the UN, all these feckless tribunals, would they accept, how common law might deal with Putin versus Ukraine? And that might actually result in, Putin retaining some of those Russian areas of what we now call Ukraine. And the Ukrainians losing some of those. I mean, that might be the uneasy common law solution, that would be worked out among the parties. But, in the West, they would say, no. Putin's a war criminal. He's Hitler. This is Neville Chamberlain at Munich. He needs to be completely kicked out of, all these incursions, which have happened since February, have to be completely reversed. He needs to be completely kicked out, get nothing. Moreover, he needs to be treated as a war criminal and probably removed from office. That's a pretty absolutist view, and that may be morally satisfying, but that may also result in more dead Ukrainians as a practical reality.
Yeah, I think, like, in a way, this invasion has revealed some internal contradictions among some liberals of varying stripes, because, as you say, they despise nationalism. But over the course of like 1 week, I've seen so many people who are down on nationalism become raving Ukrainian nationalists. And I think it kind of gets to like a fundamentalist ideological conception of the world, where it's just what Putin's doing is wrong, so we can't stand for it, and it's a complete just ignoring reality. I mean, this war is absolutely terrible, and there's so much suffering, and it really seems to me there's not going to be much Ukraine left. A huge portion of the population has left the country, most likely never to return if they can stay in Europe. And the economic damage that's being done is, I suspect, one figure I saw is it's reached 100 billion, and that is in 2 months. I mean, one person did this calculation that the steel plant that's all in the news, where the literal neo-Nazis are holed up, probably produces about 4% or so of Ukraine's entire GDP. So it's just, when I tried to promote a more realistic look at the situation of like, oh, Ukraine should probably negotiate and give up some land, people went nuts. Like, I had a friend, well, now a former friend, accused me of being a Putin stooge who, wanted Ukraine to be conquered and all kinds of stuff. So it's a perfect example of how ideology can just lead people to crazy outcomes. Whereas, and I think Mises was really concerned with the practical effects of choices. I mean, he was a consequentialist, but yeah, it's very depressing, and I agree. A willingness to change borders, to have kind of more decentralization, would help avoid these things. But and I think it also, I mean, we could talk about it for like 3 hours, but the finding the right equilibrium between nationalism and liberalism and things like that. But in our time remaining, I wanted to pivot to something you brought up way at the beginning, which was higher education. And you mentioned Charles Murray and the idea that a lot of students should not be in undergrad. And that's completely my experience. When I was a teaching assistant during my brief time in grad school, I was horrified at how, I don't want to say dumb the students were, but at how they were not intellectually curious at all, and they were very unknowledgeable, especially about things that they claimed to care about. I mean, there were students in my intro to politics class who worked on a Senate campaign the summer before they started their freshman year of college, who could not tell us who Mitch McConnell was. They didn't know who the Senate Majority Leader at the time was, and things like that. So I think a lot of people are wasting a lot of time and money, and that money is in a way subsidizing a lot of craziness in higher education. And I went to grad school for a PhD and I ended up dropping out. I learned so much. My professors were awesome, but I always take it upon myself to play the devil's advocate because I know so many intellectually inclined people who they love ideas and they love going to Mises U, and they're like, I should go and get a PhD. That's the natural thing to do. And I caution them to think long and hard about that. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on the traditional grad school path these days.
Well, it's not for most people. If Charles Murray is correct, that maybe only a fraction of people who currently go to undergrad ought to, then only a tiny fraction of them ought to go on to postgraduate, right? Especially a PhD, because there's a huge amount of opportunity cost in terms of your youth, your 20s, and so not only the time but also the money you're not out there making in some job. And then oftentimes the prospects for a lot of people in PhD programs, the brass ring would be a tenured teaching slot somewhere, something like out of a movie where you're in some leafy town. It kind of looks like Grove City, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And you sort of sit around all day and you have to teach some classes, but you get to think and read and write your own stuff and smoke a pipe. And it's all very, maybe you don't get rich, but it's very attractive lifestyle. And that is almost a mirage for the vast majority, I think, of PhD students in this day and age, because the number of spots in universities is probably going to shrink because the generation behind millennials is much smaller, Gen Z. And then there was a baby bust during COVID. So, 18 years after COVID, there's not going to be a very big freshman class across the street from me at Auburn. So, all the demographics are against you. And a PhD is really supposed to be pretty specialized knowledge. I don't think most people are probably cut out for the loneliness. I don't think and I certainly don't have a PhD, but I know a lot of PhDs and I know a lot of PhD students. And one thing that they talk about is just the loneliness, because you're really sort of on your own. You've decided on some really particular area of maybe a particular field or a particular scholar to focus on. Is pretty specialized. And so the broader audience for it is pretty small. And so as you're doing this, I think a lot of PhD students, they feel sort of removed from society and they're not in the game of life. And it's very lonely. It's very isolating. And so there are people for whom academic work is absolutely, they're just totally suited to it. It's their nature. They love to just sit down and read a bunch of sources and synthesize them. But that's the idea that it's fulfilling or stimulating, only if you're wired that way. And so not only is it not, suited for most people, not only is it lonely and isolating and has huge opportunity costs, but it's damn hard work. I mean, physically, mentally exhausting to do real academic work, not schlocky stuff where you're just glossing over a bunch of sources. And we all know what I'm talking about. There are plenty of articles and books where if you go back and look at all the references in the end notes, damn well that author didn't read all of those comprehensively and really suss out every sort of what if in the prior literature before he or she came to their novel conclusion or advanced the ball somehow. But to really sit down and write a real academic paper where you are thinking about the existing literature, you're reading it thoroughly, you're chasing down those rabbit holes and what ifs, and you're coming up with something new, and you're citing all those things that led you to it. That's pretty painstaking, detailed work. That's not easy, and you got to have what Nixon called an iron butt to sit in a chair and read and think. I mean, very, very tough sledding, and and then again, after all that work, the brass ring is that tenured spot. I don't know. I mean, I can't speak to other disciplines, but in economics, PhDs are getting jobs. I mean, it is a relative bright spot amongst other disciplines, but a lot of those jobs are in, let's say, investment banking, where you're going to be forecasting and working with numbers and modeling, which is not very Austrian. Or it is in really what I consider a fairly bogus field of behavioral economics. For example, Amazon is a huge employer now of PhD economists, and these are very smart people, but what are they really doing? At the end of the day, it's getting the chimpanzee to click 3 times instead of 4. Excuse me, 4 times instead of 3, right? Because they added this to their cart, and now we look at all the data behind, well, what makes someone add another thing to their cart, and you sort of crunch all those numbers, and that's probably not what most people thought of as economics when they first developed an interest in the field. And especially if they developed an interest through reading Rothbard and Mises, which would be looked down upon by these more quantitative or empirical economists as that's literary economics. That's just words. Everything ought to be able to be put into an equation or modeled out. So if someone wants to get a PhD in economics, they're probably not going to be jobless, but they're also probably not going to be having a career like Paul Samuelson or someone like that, where they can sort of teach a few classes, have a bunch of TAs that do all the real hard work, and then spend all their time writing scholarly things that they just have a personal interest in. I mean, that's a tiny percentage of PhDs. And I'll tell you what, their dirty secret is there's an awful lot of them out there driving between 2 or 3 community colleges, getting paid, maybe $1,800 to teach us a class at a community college and putting together an income. So very, very tough road. And I would just caution anyone, give it a good year of contemplation before you commit.
And on the loneliness note, I think that's even worse for libertarians and classical liberal students. I mean, at my program, I had no issues with that. I mean, I wrote a paper on Mises and everything, but I personally know several people, like my one friend, completely whitewashed his resume. He took out all references to papers he's had published, like with Cato, and things he's done with IHS and things. And he's basically like, yeah, I'm not going to do any work on anything related to libertarianism until I get tenure. And I know other people like that too. And it's just, I think that Perb Island, I think he was on the Robert Murphy show, said something that it's like, you run the risk of losing your soul hiding like that. And it's just very unpleasant. And you're spot on with the jobs. I mean, there were many factors that led to me dropping out, but part of it is political theory as a specialized field in political science departments is going extinct. And a lot of people have to do other things and then also do political theory and whatnot. But in terms of alternatives for the intellectually curious, I mean, personally, we can look at Mises himself. I mean, he had to work at the Vienna Chamber of Commerce for years and years and years and never really had got the respect he deserved and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, there's lots of other ways that you can pursue a life of the mind and do things you're interested in without having to go to grad school, I'd say. And speaking of grad school, I also wanted to give you a chance to talk about the Mises Institute's Economics Master's Program, because I think, it's a very innovative way for people who want deeper knowledge, want to learn more, to do that without all of the baggage and hassle and huge opportunity cost that comes with traditional grad school. So what's the deal with that?
Well, there is less opportunity cost because first and foremost, it's cheap.
Yeah.
Cheap with a capital C. It's about $5,000, a little less for a 2-year program. So you divvy that up by the 30 hours involved, and that's pretty cheap per hour. So it's subsidized and wonderfully cheap. Also, the opportunity costs are less because you don't have to quit your job or move to attend. It is an online program, and you can maintain, if you're able, of full-time job and family and other obligations if you have those. But here's the thing. This is graduate level work, and we're unapologetically pure Austrian. All the other schools have their opportunity to teach Samuelson's lousy textbook, and they can monetarism, and they can teach Keynesian, they can teach equilibrium nonsense, they can teach whatever they want. But a pure Austrian grad school is something that Mises always wanted, it's something that Rothbard always wanted. And so we do have a quantitative class, but it is designed to show the limitations of quantitative analysis. And so it's a real Austrian program in terms of how we teach money, how we teach capital theory, how we teach method, you name it. It's a real Austrian program, and it's not for everyone. And what I mean by that is you don't necessarily have to have an undergraduate degree in economics to be accepted, but it helps. And it's tough because it's subsidized and very, very cheap. We feel comfortable with being pretty tough on the application process. And we also feel pretty comfortable kicking people out if they are cutting it. Now, we haven't had much of that, but I'm just saying because you're not paying full freight or anything close. So given those two things, we estimate it, and we tell people it's about a 20-hour-a-week commitment in terms of the reading and the prep. And there's plenty of collaboration with your other students. We use Canvas, which is a typical program used at a lot of schools. So there's interaction with your fellow students at office hours and all those kind of traditional hallmarks. But 20 hours a week is no joke.
Yep.
If you have a job and you have a family or you have whatever, that's like a pretty rigorous part-time job. So we really ask people to think about, it's not for dilettantes. It's not for people who just, I kind of think Austrian economics is interesting, so this would be fun. It's like, no, this is graduate level work, and that includes a thesis paper. So it's not undergrad stuff.
Yep.
And that, you have professors like Peter Klein or Joe Salerno or Bob Murphy or Per Byland, so it's a lot of people like the idea of it, but they may not like the reality because they aren't necessarily equipped to do graduate level econ work. So that's not a warning. It's more just an explanation of what the program is designed to be. So we're thrilled with getting some people out there with our master's degree behind them. So it's been interesting putting it together, to put it mildly, but it's a great bargain if it is the kind of thing you're interested in. Yeah,
I definitely think people should check it out if they're on the fence and just explore it some more. It could be a, if, like we're talking about, a PhD is not for you, but you have the chops to do it and all that. So one last thing before we close, some listeners might know, but a lot probably don't, that you actually majored in undergrad in literature. And so kind of getting back to the theme of of having a more expansive worldview beyond purely electoral politics and arguing on Twitter about the latest libertarian drama, I'm curious what some literature suggestions you would have for the audience that you think people would find enriching and also just open them up to an aspect of the world they might not have explored before.
Well, I guess I'm fortunate in that I'm old enough to have come of age in a time where you still could just read fiction. And it just seems like that's really hard for people today because of we're all absorbed in this digital world. So novels have kind of gone the way of the dodo bird. But I will say this. In my undergraduate years, I was forced to write a lot of 10-page papers on a deadline. And that in and of itself, I think was very valuable. And if you go to corporate America today, especially among the 20 and 30 somethings, you will find very, very, very poor writing. Very poor. Like, can't even put a paragraph together poor. Mm-hmm. So if you can simply write competently, you don't have to be eloquent. You don't have to be a stylist. If you can simply write competent prose or directions, I think that in and of itself should be very valuable to an employer. So I don't necessarily think English majors are unemployable. But I think that fiction, if you have the time and if you have the inclination, it does give you the opportunity to expand your horizons. It's not like it's saccharine. It's not like good fiction is junk food. Mm-hmm. Good fiction is every bit as valuable to your brain cells as good economics. It's just different. So yeah, if you want to go read Dostoevsky or something like that, you're going to get some pretty heavy duty, narrative. If you can go read like the Flashman novels and get a tremendous amount of Victorian England history from those, novels set in a historical setting. You can go read James Michener. There's all kinds of things you can go read that'll give you knowledge. I mean, my particular area or love is 20th century British satire. So I love Evelyn Waugh. I love Graham Greene. I love Kingsley Amis. That sort of thing. But yeah, I wish I ought to do more of it. But fiction is, I guess people just feel too busy to read fiction. And I know that that's actually true when we consider our social media time wasting and that sort of thing. But if you can write, I'll tell you what, you can display that even in a letter to a would-be employer. And I think you got a huge leg up.
Yeah. Yeah, that's been my experience as a freelance writer. I mean, I don't consider myself to be particularly great at it, but there is quite a demand these days. And even before I got into it, when I was in DC, at lots of professional development things, people were stressing, we need good writers. So yeah, and that was one of the benefits for my undergrad is, like you, tons and tons of papers. It's just papers all the time. And I definitely think that was a help. But thank you so much for coming on. Sure. We're out of time, but I think this was a really valuable discussion and people will have a lot of things to think about. And looking forward to having you on again sometime. So thank you so much.
I enjoyed it. Thank you, Zachary.
Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. I hope you found that to be an interesting discussion. If you're new to the podcast and curious what we're all about and what I mean when I say this podcast is about right-wing liberal humanism, I'd encourage you to check out episode number 1. And if you're interested, you can subscribe on your preferred podcasting medium and also YouTube. And I'd encourage you to follow us on Twitter to keep up with all the latest updates. And you can also join our free Discord server if you'd like to continue the conversation. And if you'd like to help support make some more of these episodes, feel free to contribute on Patreon. Thanks so much for joining us today. I am your host, Zach Yost.